Sometimes, life strips away everything you thought mattered, leaving you with nothing but the beating of your own heart. For 7 long years, Boone had lived alone in his mountain cabin, speaking only to memories of his dead wife. In the winter of 1885, a terrible blizzard brought him Sadie, a young widow with a small child, both nearly frozen and desperate. She had lost her husband, her home, and everything she owned. He had given up on human connection long ago. As the snow trapped them together in his simple cabin, something unexpected began to grow between two people who believed they had nothing left to offer the world. Through quiet conversations and shared meals, they discovered that sometimes the heart finds what it needs in the most unlikely places. But what happens when two broken souls realize they might be each other's salvation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Wyoming peaks like memories that refused to fade, and Boone McKinnon stood at his cabin window, watching the sun paint the snow-covered pines in shades of gold. His weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, steam rising between his fingers like the ghosts of conversations he'd never have again. 7 winters had passed since Martha's cough had finally claimed her. 7 winters since he'd spoken her name aloud to anything but the wind. The cabin sat perched on a ledge halfway up Copper Mountain, accessible only by a narrow trail that most folks wouldn't dare attempt even in good weather. Boone had built it that way on purpose after Martha passed, when the well-meaning condolences of townsfolk had become unbearable. Up here, the only sounds were the whisper of wind through pine boughs, the distant cry of hawks, and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat, a sound that sometimes surprised him with its persistence. Around his neck, hidden beneath his flannel shirt, hung a thin leather cord. Threaded on it was Martha's wedding ring, a simple band of gold that had warmed against his chest for so many years, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, he'd hold it between his fingers and remember the way she'd twist it when she was thinking, the way it caught the lamplight when she needed bread, the way it felt when she'd touch his face during her final days. The cabin itself bore witness to their life together. Martha's recipe book still sat on the kitchen shelf, its pages yellowed and corners worn from years of use. Her handwriting filled the margins, notes about adding more salt to the cornbread, reminders about Tommy Peterson's boy being allergic to eggs, small observations about their neighbors' preferences. Boone hadn't opened it since the funeral, but he couldn't bring himself to put it away either. On this particular morning, December 15th, 1885, Boone felt the familiar restlessness that came with dwindling supplies. His root cellar was well stocked for winter, but he needed coffee, sugar, and ammunition. The nearest trading post was a half-day's ride down treacherous mountain paths, but the weather had been holding clear for a week. If he left now, he could make the round trip before any storms moved in. He saddled his horse, a sturdy Mare named Belle, who'd been with him almost as long as he'd been alone. As he secured his saddlebags, Boone's mind wandered to the letter he'd received last month from Sheriff Coleman in Pine Ridge. The lawman had been trying to convince him to take up the deputy badge again, claiming the territory needed experienced men. Boone had worn a badge once, back when he and Martha lived in town, back when he believed he could make a difference in other people's lives. That seemed like another man's story now. The trail down Copper Mountain wound through stands of aspen and pine, past frozen streams and rocky outcroppings that formed natural shelters. Boone knew every turn, every hazard, every shortcut. This was his domain now, his kingdom of silence and snow. Belle's hooves crunched steadily in the packed snow, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air dot as he rode. Boone's thoughts turned to the woman he'd glimpsed at the trading post last month, a young widow named Sadie Miller, traveling with a small boy. She'd looked lost, desperate in the way that only someone who'd lost everything could look. He'd minded his own business then, as he always did, but something about the set of her shoulders, the way she'd held her son's hand, had stayed with him. Sadie Miller had arrived in Pine Ridge 3 months ago, driving a weathered wagon pulled by a single-tired mule. Her husband had died in a mining accident outside Colorado Springs, and the company had wasted no time in claiming their small house to cover debts she hadn't known existed. With nowhere else to go and winter approaching, she'd heard there might be work in the Wyoming Territory, perhaps as a seamstress or taking in laundry. What she'd found instead was a town full of rough miners and cowboys with little need for a widow's domestic skills. The money she'd scraped together for the journey was nearly gone, and her son, Tommy, a bright-eyed boy of 8, was beginning to ask questions she couldn't answer. Where would they sleep when the boarding house owner demanded payment she couldn't make? What would they eat when the last of their provisions ran out? The mule that pulled their meager possessions was as worn down as Sadie herself. Old Moses had belonged to her late husband, a faithful animal who'd worked the small mining claims that had never quite paid off. Now he was their only means of transportation, their last remaining link to the life they'd lost. Sadie had turned down 2 offers to buy him, knowing that without Moses, she and Tommy would be completely stranded. On this same December morning, as Boone made his way down a mountain, Sadie was loading their few belongings onto the wagon with shaking hands. The boarding house owner had given her until noon to sell her account or find somewhere else to go. The woman hadn't been cruel about it. Times were hard for everyone, but business was business, and charity didn't pay the bills. "Mama, where are we going?" Tommy asked, clutching his wooden horse, a toy his father had carved for him the winter before the accident. The horse was painted red and blue, though the colors had faded and chipped from constant handling. "We're going to find someplace better," Sadie replied, trying to keep the fear from her voice. She'd been telling him variations of this lie for months now, and she could see in his young face that he was beginning to understand the truth that they had nowhere to go. The wind was picking up, and dark clouds were gathering over the mountains to the west. Sadie had lived in Colorado long enough to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. She needed to find shelter soon, but where? The nearest town was 2 days' travel, assuming the weather held and Moses didn't give out completely. As she secured the last of their possessions under a worn canvas tarp, Sadie allowed herself a moment of honest despair. Her husband's death had shattered more than her heart. It had destroyed her faith in the future, a belief that hard work and good intentions were enough to build a life on. She'd been a fool to think she could make it on her own. A fool, too. Believe that somewhere in this vast territory there was a place for a widow and her child. But Tommy was depending on her, and that was enough to keep her moving. It had to be. She helped him up onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. Moses snorted and stamped, eager to be moving despite his exhaustion. Animals, Sadie had learned, often had more sense than people when it came to recognizing danger. "Hold on tight, sweetheart," she told Tommy, and guided the mule onto the mountain road that led away from Pine Ridge and into the unknown. Neither Sadie nor Boone could have imagined that their paths were about to cross in a way that would change both their lives forever. The storm that was building over the western peaks would prove to be more than just another winter blizzard. It would be the force that brought 2 lost souls together in the wilderness. 2 people who had given up on the possibility of connection, of healing, of love. Sometimes the heart finds what it needs in the most unlikely places, and sometimes salvation comes disguised as catastrophe. On this December morning in 1885, as snow began to fall and the wind began to howl, neither Boone nor Sadie knew they were about to discover just how true that could be. The blizzard struck with the fury of something alive and vengeful. What had begun as gentle snowflakes quickly transformed into a howling wall of white the reduced visibility to mere feet. Boone had made it to the trading post and back, his saddlebags heavy with supplies, when the storm caught him still 2 miles from home. Bell struggled against the wind, a sure footing challenged by the rapidly accumulating snow. Through the chaos of swirling white, Boone caught sight of something that made him pull hard on the reins. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree or abandoned equipment, but as he squinted through the storm, his heart clenched with recognition. There, barely visible beside the trail, was a wagon tilted at an odd angle, and next to it, the dark shape of a mule standing with its head down against the wind. Boone dismounted and fought his way through the knee-deep snow. What he found made his blood run cold. A woman sat slumped against the wagon wheel, her arms wrapped around a small boy. Both were dusted with snow, their lips blue with cold, their bodies frighteningly still. "Ma'am!" he shouted over the wind, dropping to his knees beside them. The woman's eyes fluttered open, dark brown eyes, full of pain and exhaustion. She tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too violently to form words. It was Sadie Miller, the widow he'd seen at the trading post. And the boy in her arms, Tommy, clutching that wooden horse, was barely conscious, his small body shivering uncontrollably. "Can you hear me?" Boone asked, pulling off his heavy coat and wrapping it around both of them. Sadie nodded weakly, trying to pull her son closer to her body. My boy," she managed to whisper. "Please help my boy." Boone's mind raced. They were dying, both of them. Hypothermia was setting in, and they had minutes, not hours, before it would be too late. His cabin was still 2 miles up a treacherous mountain trail, but it was their only chance. "I'm going to get you to safety," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him over the storm. "I need you to stay awake. Do you understand?" Working quickly, Boone lifted Tommy from his mother's arms. The boy was so light, so cold, that Boone's heart nearly stopped. He wrapped him in one of his own blankets and secured him to Bell's saddle, then turned back to Sadie. "Can you stand?" he asked, but she was already falling forward. He caught her and lifted her bodily, surprised by how little she weighed. Desperation had clearly been her companion for longer than just this storm. The mule Moses, he remembered her calling him, stood patiently despite the raging wind. The animal's loyalty in staying with his charges when he could have sought shelter impressed Boone. He quickly unhitched the mule from the broken wagon and fashioned a lead rope. They couldn't save the wagon or its contents, but he wouldn't leave the animal to die. The journey up the mountain trail was a nightmare of wind and snow. Boone led Bell on foot, Sadie unconscious in his arms, Tommy secured to the saddle and wrapped in every blanket Boone possessed. The trail that he knew by heart became treacherous and unfamiliar in the storm. Twice, he nearly walked off the edge of a cliff, saved only by Bell's instincts and Moses's sure footing behind them. By the time they reached the cabin, Boone could barely feel his own hands and feet. He burst through the door, carrying Sadie while Tommy still clung weakly to the saddle horn. The warmth of the cabin was like a physical blow after the bitter cold outside. Boone's survival instincts, honed by years of mountain living, took over. He laid Sadie on his bed and quickly began building up the fire in the stone hearth. Tommy, he placed on the floor near the fireplace, still wrapped in blankets. Both mother and son were frighteningly still, their skin pale and cold to the touch. He filled pots with water and set them to heat, then began the careful process of warming their bodies. Too much heat too quickly could be as dangerous as the cold itself. He rubbed Sadie's hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, then did the same for Tommy. The boy's wooden horse had somehow remained clutched in his small fist throughout the ordeal. "Come on," Boone murmured, working over Tommy's still form. "Come on, son, stay with me." As if responding to his voice, Tommy's eyelids fluttered. A weak cough escaped his lips, and then another. Boone felt a rush of relief so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. "That's it," he encouraged. Keep breathing. Sadie was slower to respond, but gradually her shivering began, a good sign that her body was trying to warm itself. Boone continued his ministrations, checking their pulse, monitoring their breathing, doing everything he could think of to keep them alive. As the hours passed and the storm raged outside, Boone found himself in the strange position of caring for strangers in his sanctuary of solitude. The cabin that had known only silence for 7 years was now filled with the sounds of labored breathing, the crackle of the fire, and his own voice as he spoke encouraging words to his unconscious patients. Tommy was the first to truly wake. His eyes opened and focused on Boone's face with the clarity of childhood, taking in this bearded stranger who had somehow appeared in his moment of greatest need. "Mama," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse. "She's right here," Boone assured him, nodding toward the bed where Sadie lay. "You're both safe now. Are you an angel?" Tommy asked with the innocent directness of an 8-year-old dot. Despite everything, Boone found himself almost smiling. "No, son. Just a man who happened to be in the right place." As dawn broke over the mountains, the storm began to subside, but its work was done. 3 strangers were now trapped together in a small cabin, bound by circumstance and the simple fact that they were all still alive. Sadie finally opened her eyes as the first light filtered through the cabin's single window, and her gaze immediately found her son. "Tommy," she breathed, trying to sit up. "Easy," Boone said, moving to steady her. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Sadie looked at him with those dark brown eyes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was something in her gaze, gratitude, yes, but also a wariness born of too much loss, too much disappointment. "You saved us," she said quietly. Boone shook his head. "I happened to be passing by." "In a blizzard?" she asked, and he could see the intelligence behind her exhaustion. "Storms move fast in the mountains," he replied, not wanting to examine too closely why he'd been out in such weather. "What matters is you're both alive." Outside, the wind still howled around the cabin's eaves, and snow continued to fall. They were trapped here together, a mountain man who had chosen solitude, a desperate widow, and her young son. None of them knew it yet, but this storm had changed everything. In saving their lives, Boone had opened his heart to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to spend the rest of his days alone. The first 3 days passed in a careful dance of politeness and boundaries. Sadie insisted on sleeping on the floor near the fire despite Boone's protests, unwilling to take his bed when he had already done so much. Tommy recovered quickly, as children do, his natural curiosity about their strange surroundings, overcoming the trauma of their near-death experience. Boone found himself in the awkward position of hosting guests in a space that had been designed for solitude. Every movement seemed amplified in the small cabin. The rustle of Sadie's skirts as she moved about, Tommy's whispered questions to his mother, the unfamiliar rhythm of other people's breathing as they slept. It should have been unbearable. But instead, Boone discovered something he hadn't expected. The sounds of human presence, rather than disturbing his peace, seemed to fill hollows in his chest he hadn't realized were empty. Martha's recipe book proved to be a source of both comfort and pain. On the second morning, as Boone struggled to prepare breakfast for 3 instead of 1, Sadie noticed him fumbling with proportions. "May I?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the stove. Boone hesitated. This was Martha's kitchen, Martha's domain, preserved exactly as she'd left it. But watching him burn the Johnny cakes while Tommy looked on with polite 8-year-old hunger seemed worse than letting someone else use her space. "I'm not much of a cook," he admitted, stepping back. Sadie moved to the stove with the efficiency of someone who had learned to make much from little. Her hands were gentle as she handled Martha's cast-iron pan, respectful of the obvious care with which the kitchen had been maintained. She didn't comment on the dust that covered some of the higher shelves, or the way certain cupboards seemed untouched, as if they held relics too precious to disturb. "Your wife was a good cook," she observed, glancing at the recipe book that lay open on the counter. "The best," Boone replied, his voice rough with memory. Tommy, meanwhile, had discovered the woodpile behind the cabin and appointed himself Boone's assistant in keeping the fire fed. The boy attacked the task with the serious dedication of someone trying to prove his worth, his small arms straining to carry logs that were almost too big for him. "You don't have to do that, son," Boone told him, but Tommy shook his head firmly. "Mama says we earn our keep," the boy replied with dignity that was heartbreaking in someone so young. "She says we don't take charity." Boone glanced at Sadie, who was focused intently on the griddle, her cheeks flushed with what might have been embarrassment or determination. He understood then that their pride was all they had left, and taking even that from them would be a cruelty worse than the prestud. Cold they'd nearly died from. "Well then," Boone said seriously, "I reckon I need all the help I can get. These logs won't carry themselves." The storm outside showed no signs of abating. Snow continued to fall steadily, and the wind howled around the cabin's walls like something, while trying to get in. On the third evening, as they sat around the fire after supper, Boone found himself studying his unexpected guests. Sadie had a quiet strength about her that reminded him of the mountain women he'd known in his youth. Women who could birth babies and bury husbands and keep going because stopping wasn't an option. Her dark hair was pinned back severely, and her dress, though clean and mended, showed the wear of hard travel. But her hands were steady, her voice calm when she spoke to Tommy, and there was something in her eyes that suggested depths of resilience Boone was only beginning to understand. Tommy was all boy curious, energetic, and surprisingly untroubled by their circumstances. He peppered Boone with questions about the mountains, about wildlife, about how to tell if snow was going to stick or melt. His father, Sadie had mentioned, had been a mining man, more comfortable underground than in the open wilderness, so all of this was new and fascinating to the child. "Mr. Boone," Tommy said as they watched the fire dance in the hearth, "how come you live up here all by yourself?" "Tommy," Sadie won quietly, but Boone held up a hand. "It's all right," he said. How to explain to a child the weight of grief? The way loss could make even the company of friends feel like an invasion? "Sometimes a man needs quiet to think," he said finally. "What do you think about?" Tommy persisted with the relentless curiosity of childhood. Boone was quiet for a long moment, aware of Sadie's eyes on him. "I think about the woman I loved," he said honestly, "and how to be the man she would have wanted me to be." Something in his tone must have conveyed the sadness behind the words, because Tommy nodded solemnly and didn't ask any more questions. That night, as Boone lay in his bed listening to the soft breathing of his guests, he found himself thinking about Martha in a way he hadn't for years. Not with the sharp ache of fresh grief, but with something gentler gratitude for the time they'd had. Wonder at how completely she had changed his life simply by loving him. For the first time since her death, he wasn't alone with those memories. The next morning brought a break in the storm, though the snow was still too deep and the wind too fierce for travel. Sadie woke before dawn and, moving quietly so as not to wake Tommy, began cleaning the cabin with the thoroughness of someone who understood that cleanliness was another form of earning one's keep. Boone found her washing his dishes with soap she'd somehow produced from her meager possessions, her movements efficient and careful. "You don't need to do that," he said, but she shook her head. "I need to do something," she replied. "I can't just sit here and take your hospitality without giving something back." He understood that too, the need to contribute, to matter, to prove that you weren't just taking up space in the world. It was a feeling he'd battled himself in the dark months after Martha's death, when staying alive had seemed more burden than blessing. "There's mending that needs doing," he offered carefully. "If you're willing." The relief in her eyes told him he'd found the right balance between help offered and dignity preserved. As the day wore on, they settled into an easy routine. Boone teaching Tommy the basics of mountain survival, Sadie quietly restoring order to corners of the cabin that had been neglected during his years of solitude. By evening, the cabin felt different. Not just cleaner, though it was that. Not just warmer, though the fire burned brighter with Tommy's enthusiastic attention to the woodpile. It felt alive in a way it hadn't for 7 long years, as if the presence of hope and purpose had awakened something that had been sleeping in its walls. Neither Boone nor Sadie spoke of what would happen when the storm finally passed and travel became possible again. But as they sat by the fire that 4th night, listening to Tommy's soft breathing as he slept, both of them were beginning to understand that some storms changed more than just the weather. The storm continued into its 2nd week, and what had begun as temporary shelter was settling into something that felt dangerously close to home. Boone woke each morning to the sound of Sadie moving quietly around the kitchen, the soft murmur of her voice as she helped Tommy dress, the domestic rhythms he thought he buried with Martha 7 years ago. On the wooden shelf above his bed, beside Martha's Bible, sat the carved wooden cross he'd made during those first awful months of grief. He'd whittled it from pine during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, when the silence of the cabin had seemed to press against him like a physical weight. The cross had been meant as a prayer, a plea for understanding, for some sign that Martha's suffering and death had meaning beyond the cruel randomness of disease. But as the months turned to years, the cross had become something else, a symbol of his lost faith, his inability to find God's hand in his tragedy. He'd kept it not as comfort, but as a reminder of his spiritual barrenness, the way some men keep scars as proof of battles fought and lost. Now, watching Tommy examine it with the reverence children showed to adult mysteries, Boone found himself remembering the man who had carved it, a man still hoping for answers, still believing that meaning could be found in meaningless loss. "Did you make this?" Tommy asked, his small fingers tracing the careful lines Boone had cut into the wood. "Long time ago," Boone replied, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "It's beautiful," the boy said simply, and something in Boone's chest loosened at the innocent appreciation. The days had settled into patterns that felt both natural and strange. Tommy followed Boone around the cabin like a devoted puppy, eager to learn everything about mountain survival. The boy had a quick mind and gentle hands, traits that served him well when Boone taught him to whittle, to read weather signs, to understand the language of wind and snow. "A storm like this," Boone explained as they stood at the window watching the endless white, "she's got her own life. You don't fight her, you wait her out, respect her power." "How long do they last?" Tommy asked, his breath fogging the glass. "As long as they need to," Boone said, then caught himself. That was a mountain man's answer, the kind of philosophical acceptance that came from years of solitude. A child needed something more concrete. "Could be another week," he amended. "Maybe 2 if she's really got her teeth in the winter." Behind them, Sadie worked at mending one of Boone's shirts, her needle moving in steady, careful stitches. She had gifted hands for such work, precise and sure, with an eye for making repairs that would last. More than once, Boone had caught himself watching those hands, wondering about the life that had taught her such skills, the hardships that had made her so self-sufficient. "Your boy's got good instincts," he told her that evening as Tommy slept by the fire, his wooden horse clutched in one hand. "His father was the same way," Sadie replied softly. "Quick to learn, eager to help." Tommy gets that honest nature from him. It was the first time she'd volunteered information about her late husband, and Boone found himself curious despite his usual reticence about other people's pain. "What was he like?" he asked carefully, Sadie's hand stilled on her mending. "Good," she said simply. "Not particularly wise or brave or remarkable in any way the world would measure, but good through and through. He worked hard, loved his family, tried to do right by everyone he met. Her voice grew softer. I sometimes think that's rarer than wisdom or bravery. Boone nodded, understanding. Martha had been the same nod. A woman who would be remembered in history books, but someone who made every life she touched a little better simply by being in it. Tommy's lucky to have had him for a father, Boone said. And unlucky to have lost him so young, Sadie replied. But without bitterness. It was simply a fact. The way mountain weather was a fact, something to be acknowledged and endured rather than raged against thought as the week wore on. Boone found himself noticing things about Sadie that had nothing to do with grief or hardship. The way she hummed softly while she worked, melodies he didn't recognize, but that filled the cabin with something sweeter than silence. The careful way she rationed the coffee he bought at the trading post, making sure there would be enough. For all of them. The quiet strength in her voice when she told Tommy stories at bedtime tales of brave children and magical animals that seemed to spring from her imagination fully formed. She was beautiful, he realized one afternoon as she sat by the window taking advantage of the weak winter light for her sewing. Not in the dramatic way that turned men's heads, but in the subtle way of women who had learned to find grace in hardship. Her face had a serenity that spoke of acceptance without surrender, and when she smiled at something Tommy said, it transformed her features completely. The recognition of her beauty brought with it a stab of something Boone had thought he buried with Martha desire. Yes, but more than that. A longing for connection, for the particular intimacy that came from sharing daily life with someone who understood both your strength and your vulnerability. Thought it was a dangerous realization. And at that night he lay awake listening to the storm and trying to convince himself that what he felt was nothing more than gratitude for the company. Loneliness making him imagine deeper feelings that weren't really there. But the next morning, when Sadie smiled at him over her coffee cup and asked how he'd slept, Boone knew he was lying to himself. What he felt was real and growing stronger with each day they spent together in the small cabin. The problem was that he had nothing to offer her except this isolated life. This retreat from the world that had sustained him in his grief, but would be no kind of life for a woman with a child to raise. She deserved better than a broken-down mountain hermit with more ghosts than prospects. That afternoon, Tommy found him carving by the fire and settled beside him with his own piece of wood and the small knife Boone had given him. "Mr. Boone," the boy said in the serious tone he used for important questions, "do you think my mama's pretty?" The question caught Boone off guard, and he nearly sliced his thumb with the carving knife. "I think your mama's a fine woman," he sighed carefully. "She is pretty," Tommy said with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. "And she's smart, and she makes good biscuits, and she never gets mad even when I track mud in the house." "Sounds like you think pretty highly of her," Boone said, fighting back a smile. "I do," Tommy replied, then looked up at Boone with eyes that held more wisdom than any 8-year-old should possess. "I think you do too." Out of the mouths of babes, Boone thought, and returned to his carving without answering. But the boy's words stayed with him for the rest of the day, a truth spoken. So simply it was impossible to deny. On the 10th day, the storm finally broke. Boone woke to silence so profound it seemed to ring in his ears. No wind howling around the eaves, no snow pelting the windows, just a deep quiet of winter mountains under fresh snow. When he looked outside, the world had been transformed into something that belonged in a child's picture book. All soft curves and pristine white under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. But the beauty came with a price. The trail down the mountain was completely impassable, buried under drifts that would take days to settle enough for safe travel. They were still trapped, but now it was by aftermath rather than storm. "Uncle Boone, look." Tommy pressed his face to the window, his breath fogging the glass as he took in the winter wonderland. The endearment had appeared naturally over the past few days, and neither Boone nor Sadie had corrected it. "That's a lot of snow, son," Boone agreed, but his mind was already working through the implications. Food wouldn't be a problem. His stores were adequate for 3 people for several more weeks if they were careful. But the longer Sadie and Tommy stayed, the more complicated everything became. He was falling in love with her. The realization had crept up on him like dawn, so gradual he hadn't noticed until it was fully upon him. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was lovely in her quiet way. It wasn't just gratitude for the life she and Tommy had brought to his empty cabin, though he was grateful. It was something deeper, the way she hummed while she worked, the gentle authority in her voice when she spoke to Tommy, the carefully hidden strength that let her face each day's uncertainties without complaint. Sadie, for her part, seemed to be fighting her own internal battles. Boone caught her looking at him sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and wariness, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. The trail should be passable in a few days, he told her as they sat by the fire that evening, Tommy asleep between them with his head pillowed on Boone's leg. "I know," she said quietly. "We can't impose on your hospitality much longer." "It's not an imposition," Boone replied, then caught himself before he could say more. What was he thinking? That she should stay forever? That a woman with a child to raise should tie her fate to a hermit who'd spent 7 years running from life? But Sadie was studying his face with those perceptive brown eyes. "What will you do?" she asked carefully. "When we're gone?" The question hung between them like smoke from the fire. What would he do? Return to his solitude, to the endless silence and the ghosts of memory? The prospect, which had once seemed like salvation, now felt like a kind of death. "Same as I've always done, I reckon," he said, but even he could hear the lie in his voice. "And what's that?" She pressed gently. Boone was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking Tommy's hair as the boy slept. "Wait," he said finally. "Wait for time to pass, for seasons to change, for—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Wait for what? For Martha to come back? For his own life to end? "That's not living," Sadie said softly. "That's just surviving." Her words hit him like a physical blow because they were true. For 7 years, he'd been surviving, getting through each day without purpose or joy, marking time until what? Until he could join Martha in whatever came after. Until the loneliness finally consumed him completely. "Maybe that's all some people get," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "I don't believe that," Sadie replied firmly. "I think everyone deserves more than just getting by." "Even you?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "What's waiting for you when you leave here? What kind of life can you build with nothing?" It was a cruel question, and he regretted it as soon as the words left his mouth. But Sadie didn't flinch. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I have to try. For Tommy's sake, if not for my own. He deserves a future, even if I can't see what it looks like from here." The next morning brought visitors, the first human contact Boone had experienced in months. He heard the voices before he saw them, calling his name through the crisp mountain air. When he opened the cabin door, he found 3 men on snowshoes, their faces red with cold and exertion. "Boone McKinnon." The lead man raised his hand in greeting. "Sheriff Coleman sent us to check on you." That was some storm. Boone recognized them, townsfolk from Pine Ridge, good men who'd volunteered for the dangerous trek up the mountain out of genuine concern. The fact that they'd risked their lives to check on a hermit who'd barely spoken to them in years said something about the kind of community he'd been avoiding. "I'm fine," Boone called back. "Appreciate you coming up." "We brought extra supplies," another man said, gesturing to the packs they carried. "Figured you might be running low." As they approached the cabin, their eyes took in the signs of occupancy footprints. In the snow, smoke from the chimney that suggested more than one person, the sound of a child's laughter from inside. You got folks staying with you? The first man asked, curiosity evident in his voice. Boone hesitated. These were good men, but they were also townspeople, and news traveled fast in small communities. Whatever he said would be all over Pine Ridge. Within a week, before he could answer, the cabin door opened and Sadie appeared, Tommy beside her. She'd obviously heard the voices and come to see what was happening. Mrs. Miller. One of the men exclaimed in surprise. We've been wondering what happened to you. You disappeared from town right before the storm hit. We got caught on the mountain, Sadie explained simply. Mr. McKinnon saved our lives. The men's eyes moved between Boone and Sadie, and he could practically see them calculating the implications. An unmarried man and a widow, snowed in together for nearly 2 weeks. It was the kind of situation that could destroy a woman's reputation, regardless of the innocent circumstances. Wow, the lead man said carefully. Main thing is you're both safe. Roads should be clear enough for travel in a day or two. We'll be ready, Sadie said. But Boone caught the slight tremor in her voice. After the men left, promising to spread word that everyone was safe, the cabin felt different. The outside world had intruded on their private sanctuary, bringing with it all the complications and judgments that Boone had fled to the mountains to escape. I'm sorry, he said to Sadie as they watched the rescue party disappear down the trail. I should have thought about what this would look like. It looks like a man helping strangers in distress, she replied firmly. Anyone who sees more than that has a dirty mind and too much time on their hands. But Boone could see the worry in her eyes. In a territory where a woman's reputation was often all she had, even the appearance of impropriety could be devastating. He'd saved her life only to potentially ruin her future. That evening, as they sat by the fire for what might be their last night together, the weight of unspoken words hung heavy between them. Tommy had fallen asleep earlier, exhausted by the excitement of the visitors, leaving Boone and Sadie alone with thoughts neither seemed willing to voice. What will you do? Boone asked finally. When you get to town, I mean? Sadie was quiet. For a long moment, her hand still on the mending in her lap. Find work if I can, she said. There's a woman who takes in washing. Maybe she'd let me help. Or maybe someone needs a seamstress. And if there's no work, she met his eyes directly. Then Tommy and I will keep moving until we find somewhere. That needs what we have to offer. The courage in her voice humbled him. Here was a woman with nothing, no money, no home, no prospects, and she still believed in the possibility of building a life worth living. While he, with his cabin and his stores and his complete freedom to choose his own path, had spent 7 years waiting for death like a dog in a corner. Sadie, he began, then stopped. What could he say? That he loved her? That the thought of her leaving was tearing him apart? That he wanted to ask her to stay, but couldn't bear the thought of trapping her in his self-imposed exile? I know, she said softly, and the understanding in her voice nearly undid him. Outside, the wind was picking up again, and new snow began to fall against the windows. But inside the cabin, by the fire's warm light, 2 people sat in silence with their hearts full of words they couldn't bring themselves to speak. The new snowfall was light, more of winter's final gesture than a serious storm, but it bought them another day together. Boone woke to find Sadie already up, sitting by the window with her husband's pocket watch in her hands. It was a simple timepiece, silver-plated and worn smooth from years of handling. The kind of practical gift a working man might give his wife on their wedding day. She held it carefully, as if it might break, her thumb tracing the initials engraved. On the back, JM to SM, forever. Boone had seen her take it out before during quiet moments, had noticed the way she'd wind it each morning and evening, keeping time even when time seemed to stand still in their mountain refuge. Was that his? Boone asked quietly, not wanting to startle her. Sadie nodded, not looking away from the watch face. He gave it to me the day Tommy was born. Said, He wanted me to have something that would remind me that every moment with our son was precious. Her voice was steady, but Boone could hear the pain underneath. I've kept it running ever since, even when keeping track of time seemed pointless. And now? She was quiet for a moment, then looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Now I'm not sure if I'm keeping time or if time is keeping me. It was the most philosophical thing he'd heard her say, and it struck him how much depth lay beneath her practical exterior. This was a woman who thought deeply about life, who grappled with the same questions about meaning and purpose that had driven him to the mountains. I understand that feeling, he said, settling into the chair across from her. Do you? She asked, and there was something almost challenging in her tone. Because sometimes I think you've stopped keeping time altogether up here. Like you're waiting for the world to forget you exist. Her words stung because they were true. He had been waiting for what? He couldn't say. For the pain to fade? For Martha's memory to dim enough that he could function without the constant ache of loss? For death to claim him so he wouldn't have to figure out how to live without her? Maybe I have, he admitted. Maybe that was easier than trying to figure out what comes next. Tommy stirred from his place by the fire, mumbling something in his sleep, and both adults fell silent until they were sure he hadn't woken. There was something sacred about these early morning conversations, these moments when the world outside was still sleeping and they could speak truths they wouldn't dare voice in the full light of day. The thing is, Sadie continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I can't stop time. I can't go back to before James died, before we lost everything, before. She gestured around the cabin. Before all of this. Tommy needs me to keep moving forward, even when I don't know where we're going. You're braver than I am, Boone said, and meant it. I'm not brave, she replied firmly. I'm desperate. There's a difference. But Boone shook his head. Desperation without hope turns into surrender. You've got hope, even if you don't want to admit it. I can see it in the way you talk about finding work, about building a life for Tommy. That's not desperation, that's faith. As the morning progressed, the weight of their impending separation seemed to settle over all three of them. Tommy was quieter than usual, clinging closer to both adults, as if sensing that their time together was running out. He insisted on helping Boone with every small task, from feeding the fire to checking the weather, as if memorizing the routines they'd established. Uncle Boone, he said as they stood on the cabin's small porch, testing the stability of the snow, will you visit us when we get to town? The question hit Boone like a physical blow. How could he explain to a child that he didn't go to town, that he'd spent 7 years avoiding exactly the kind of human connection that Tommy represented? How could he make an 8-year-old understand that loving someone sometimes meant letting them go? We'll see, son, he said finally. The coward's answer that promised nothing while avoiding an outright lie. Tommy seemed to accept this, but Boone caught Sadie watching him with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what his non-answer meant. That afternoon, as they shared what might be their last meal together, the conversation turned to practical matters. Sadie had been taking inventory of their few possessions, trying to figure out what they could carry and what would have to be left behind. The wagon's probably buried under 6 feet of snow by now, she said matter-of-factly. We'll have to pack light. Moses is strong, Boone offered. It can carry a fair load. Not everything, though. I'll have to choose what matters most. She said it casually, but Boone heard the weight behind the words. A woman's entire life reduced to what could fit in saddlebags. It was a heartbreaking reality that too many people faced in this harsh territory. What will you choose? He asked. Sadie considered this seriously. Tommy's things, obviously. His clothes, his toy horse. My sewing kit, that's how I'll make our living. The watch. She paused, then added quietly, James's letters to me. I know they're not practical, but They're who you are, Boone finished. They're your history. Yes, she said, relief evident in her voice that he understood. Everything else is just things. As evening approached, they found themselves moving more slowly, as if by unspoken agreement they could stretch these final hours into something lasting. Tommy fought sleep with the desperation of a child who sensed that tomorrow would bring changes he couldn't control. But eventually exhaustion won, and he curled up by the fire with his wooden horse. He's gotten attached to you, Sadie observed, watching her son sleep. And I to him, Boone admitted. He's a good boy. His father would be proud. And you? She asked quietly. Have you gotten attached? The question hung between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. Boone looked at this remarkable woman who had somehow brought light back into his dark world, who had shown him that his heart wasn't as dead as he believed, who had given him a glimpse of what life could be like if he had the courage to reach forward. Yes, he said simply, and the words seemed to echo in the small cabin like a confession. So have I, she whispered, and in those 3 words, Boone heard everything they'd been too afraid to say: the growing love, the impossible longing, the recognition that they were perfect for each other and completely wrong for each other all. At the same time, outside, the wind picked up slightly, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter wasn't finished with them yet. But inside, by the fire's warm glow, 2 people sat with the knowledge that tomorrow would tear apart something beautiful that should never have had the chance to bloom. The sound of approaching horses broke the morning stillness like gunshots. Boone was at the window before the hoofbeats stopped, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that hung above the door. Visitors were rare enough in good weather, and winter, they usually meant trouble. A single rider sat his horse in the clearing before the cabin, steam rising from both man and animal in the cold air. Even from a distance, Boone recognized the purposeful way the man held himself, the careful way his eyes scanned the area before dismounting. Lawman. Sheriff Coleman, Boone called out as he opened the cabin door, though he'd already guessed who it would be. Boone. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s, with gray threading through his dark beard and eyes that had seen too much of human nature's darker sides. He moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned that sudden movements could mean the difference between going home and not going home at all. This is a hell of a ride to make in winter, Boone observed, but he was already stepping back to let the man inside. Whatever had brought Coleman up the mountain in these conditions was serious. The sheriff stomped the snow off his boots and accepted the cup of coffee Sadie silently offered him. His eyes took in the domestic scene, the woman tending the fire, the boy peering out from behind her skirts, the obvious signs that Boone's hermit existence had been interrupted. Mrs. Miller, Coleman said with a respectful nod. Glad to see you're safe. Folks in town were worried when you disappeared right before the storm. Mr. McKinnon saved our lives, Sadie replied simply. I'm sure he did. The sheriff's tone was neutral, but Boone caught the assessing look in his eyes. Mind if we talk privately? He asked Boone. They stepped outside, leaving Sadie and Tommy by the fire. The cold bit at Boone's face immediately, but Coleman seemed unbothered by it. Mountain men, both of them, accustomed to winter's bite. I need to ask you something, Coleman began without preamble, and I need you to answer me straight. You ever hear of a place called Cedar Creek? The name hit Boone like a physical blow. Cedar Creek, the town where he'd worn a badge for 3 years, where he'd met and married Martha, where he'd learned what it meant to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, where he'd failed so completely that he'd had to flee into the mountains rather than face what he'd become. I heard of it, he said carefully. You more than heard of it, Coleman pressed. You were deputy there for 3 years under Sheriff Hawkins, until you up and disappeared one day without so much as a goodbye. Boone's jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. 7 years, Coleman agreed. 7 years since you walked away from your badge, your duties, Your whole damn life. Want to? Tell me why. The memories came flooding back despite Boone's efforts to keep them buried. Martha's death, yes, but before that, the bank robbery he'd failed to prevent. The 3 men who died because he'd been too slow, too trusting, too convinced of his own abilities. The look in Sheriff Hawkins's eyes when they'd brought the bodies back to town. The whispers that maybe Deputy McKinnon wasn't as good as everyone thought. Personal reasons, Boone said finally. Personal reasons. Coleman's voice was dry as autumn leaves. That's what Hawkins figured. Said, you went a little crazy after your wife died. Started blaming yourself for things that weren't your fault. Some things were my fault. Maybe. Maybe not. Point is, I didn't ride up here in the middle of winter to rehash old mistakes. Coleman's expression grew serious. I rode up here because the territory needs experienced lawmen, and there aren't many of us left. I'm not a lawman anymore. You were a good one, though. Hawkins spoke highly of you before he died last month. Said you had the best instincts he'd ever seen in a deputy. Before grief clouded your judgment. The news of Hawkins's death hit Boone unexpectedly hard. The old sheriff had been like a father to him, had taught him everything he knew about reading people, about justice, about the weight of responsibility that came with a badge. What do you want from me, Coleman? I want you to come back, the sheriff said simply. Take a deputy position in Pine Ridge. The territory's growing, and we need men who understand that law isn't just about punishment. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Boone shook his head automatically. I can't. Not I don't do that anymore. Because you made some mistakes? Well, Boone, we all make mistakes. The question is whether we learn from them or let them paralyze us. Before Boone could respond, Coleman reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope worn from travel. Speaking of which, this came from Mrs. Miller. That's actually the other reason I rode up here. Boone took the envelope, noting the official seal of a law office in Denver. What is it? Legal matter concerning her late husband's estate. Seems there was some property nobody knew about, an inheritance from a relative back east. The debts that drove her out of Colorado Springs have been settled. And there's a small house waiting for her in Pine Ridge, free and clear. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Boone stared at the envelope as if it might explode in his hands. She doesn't know? Not yet. Letter was sent to the boarding house, but she'd already left town by then. The lawyer's been trying to track her down for weeks. Inside the cabin, Sadie was helping Tommy with his letters, their voices a soft murmur. That spoke of domestic contentment. She had no idea that her entire future had just changed, that the desperate circumstances that had driven her into Boone's life were about to be transformed into something entirely different. This changes things, Boone said quietly. Does it? Coleman asked. Or does it just give you both choices you didn't have before? They went back inside, where Coleman delivered the news with the straightforward efficiency of a man who'd had to deliver both good news and bad too many times to count. Sadie listened in stunned silence as he explained about the inheritance, about the house that was waiting for her, about the legal resolution of debts she thought would follow her forever. I don't understand, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. James never mentioned any relatives back east. According to the lawyer, it was a great-aunt he'd lost touch with years ago. She died 6 months back and left her property to her only surviving family, your husband. Since he's gone, it goes to you and the boy. Tommy looked between the adults with the confusion of a child who understood that something important was happening but couldn't grasp what it meant. A house? Sadie asked, as if the concept were foreign to her. Small place on the edge of town, Coleman confirmed. Nothing fancy, but it's yours. No debts, no obligations. Fresh start. Boone watched Sadie's face as the reality sank in. She was free from desperation, free from the crushing weight of poverty, free to build the kind of life she wanted for herself and Tommy. She didn't need him anymore, didn't need to choose between love and security. She could have both, just not with him. "There's one more thing," Coleman said, and his tone suggested he was coming to the real reason for his visit. "The house came with some history. The woman who owned it, Rebecca Miller, she wasn't just your husband's relative. She was married to a lawman, a deputy who worked these parts back in the territorial days. Her husband was killed in the line of duty, and she spent the rest of her life alone, never remarried, never had children of her own." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Here was a woman who'd been exactly where Sadie was now, widowed, alone, forced to make a life without the man she'd loved. But instead of finding love again, she'd chosen solitude, had died alone in a house that now stood empty, waiting for another widow to fill it. "It's like she's reaching out from the grave," Sadie said softly, "showing me what my life could become. Or what it doesn't have to become," Coleman replied, his eyes moving meaningfully between Sadie and Boone. "Choices, Mrs. Miller. That's what inheritance really gives us, the freedom to choose our own path instead of having it chosen for us." As the sheriff prepared to leave, he pulled Boone aside one more time. "Think about what I said. About the badge, about coming back to the world. Sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to keep living." After Coleman rode away, the cabin felt different. The envelope sat on the table like a tangible symbol of change, of possibilities that hadn't existed an hour before. Sadie stared at it as if it might disappear if she looked away. "Everything's different now," she said finally. "Yes," Boone agreed, though he wasn't sure if different meant better or worse. She had choices now, options that didn't include a hermit mountain man with too much baggage and too little to offer. "I don't have to choose between survival and other things anymore." "No," he said quietly, "you don't." But as they sat in the growing twilight, both of them understood that having choices didn't make choosing any easier. If anything, it made it harder, because now there would be no excuse for whatever decision she made. Now it would be purely a matter of the heart. And hearts, as both of them knew all too well, were fragile, unreliable things that could break at the worst possible moments. The land deed certificate lay spread on the table like a map to a future Sadie had never dared imagine. In careful legal script, it described a 2-bedroom house on Elm Street in Pine Ridge, complete with a small garden plot and a well. The lawyer's accompanying letter spoke of furnishings left behind, of taxes paid in advance, of a modest sum in the bank account to help with the transition. "It's real," Sadie said for the third time, her fingers tracing the official seal as if testing its solidity. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find it was all a dream." Tommy pressed close to his mother's side, studying the document with the intense focus of a child trying to understand adult complexities. "Does this mean we don't have to be worried anymore, Mama?" "It means we have choices now, sweetheart," Sadie replied, but her eyes found Boone's across the table. Choices, the word had taken on weight since Sheriff Coleman's visit, carrying implications that went far beyond simple security. Boone busied himself with packing supplies for their journey, his movements efficient but somehow reluctant. Every item he placed in the saddlebags felt like another step toward an inevitable goodbye, another acknowledgement that their time together was ending. "You should take the heavy coat," he said, holding up a thick wool garment that had belonged to Martha. "February's still cold, even in town." "I can't take your wife's things," Sadie protested, but Boone was already folding the coat with careful precision. "She would have wanted it to be useful," he said simply. "Better it keeps someone warm than hangs in a closet gathering dust." There was something final in his tone that made Sadie's chest tighten. All morning, Boone had been helpful, practical, encouraging, and utterly determined to see her safely on her way to her new life. He spoke of her inheritance as if it were the answer to prayers, of her future in town as if it were everything she could possibly want. What he didn't speak of was the possibility that she might want him to be part of that future. Boone, she began, then stopped. How could she ask him to leave his mountain sanctuary, to abandon the life he'd built around his grief, to take a chance on something as uncertain as love? How could she expect him to believe that what had grown between them in this isolated cabin could survive in the wider world? "The house sounds perfect for you and Tommy," he said, not looking up from his packing. "Close to the school, near the church. Good neighbors, from what Coleman said." "Yes," she agreed quietly. "It does sound perfect." But perfect felt like a cage when what her heart wanted was standing 3 feet away, determinedly avoiding her eyes while he folded her meager possessions with the care of a man saying goodbye to something precious. Tommy, with the uncanny perception of children, seemed to sense the tension between the adults. He'd grown increasingly clingy as the day progressed, following Boone around the cabin like a shadow, asking endless questions about mountain life as if trying to memorize every detail. "Uncle Boone," he said as they loaded the last of the supplies, "will you teach me to fish when the snow melts?" The question hung in the air like a prayer. Boone's hands stilled on the rope he was tying, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked just enough for Sadie to see the pain beneath. "There are probably folks in town who can teach you that," he said finally. "But I want you to teach me," Tommy insisted with the stubborn certainty of childhood. "You know all the best spots." "Tommy," Sadie said gently, "Uncle Boone has his own life here. We can't expect him to. Why can't he come with us?" Tommy interrupted, his voice rising with distress. "Why can't we all live in the house together, out of the mouths of babes?" The child's question cut straight to the heart of what none of them had been willing to say aloud. Why couldn't they stay together? What was stopping them from building a life as a family? "It's complicated, son," Boone said, kneeling to Tommy's eye level. "Your mama has a chance at a new start, a real home, a place where you can go to school and make friends and have all the things a boy should have. But what about you?" Tommy asked with devastating simplicity. "Won't you be lonely all by yourself?" The question hit Boone like a physical blow. Won't you be lonely? As if loneliness were something that might happen in the future rather than something he'd been drowning in for 7 years. As if he hadn't already learned that solitude and peace were very different things. "I'll be fine," he said, but even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. That evening, their last together, the cabin felt heavy with unspoken words. They ate dinner in relative silence, each lost in private thoughts about what tomorrow would bring. Tommy dozed by the fire after the meal, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day, leaving Boone and Sadie alone with their careful distance and mounting desperation. "I need to tell you something," Sadie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the house, about the inheritance. It changes everything, but it doesn't change how I feel." Boone's hands stilled on the carving he'd been working on, a small wooden bird meant as a farewell gift for Tommy. "Sadie, let me finish," she said firmly. "Please. I may never have the courage to say this again." She took a shaky breath. "I love you, Boone McKinnon. I love your gentleness and your strength and the way you've brought light back into my world when I thought I'd lost it forever. I love the way you talk to Tommy like he matters, the way you've made us feel safe and wanted and home." The words hung between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. Boone set down his carving and looked at her with eyes full of pain and longing. "I love you too," he said quietly. "More than I thought I could love anyone after Martha. But loving you doesn't mean I can give you what you need." "What do I need?" she challenged, moving closer. "Security? I have that now. A home? The deed is sitting right there on the table. Safety for Tommy? Pine Ridge is a good town with good people. "Then, what's the problem?" he asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "The problem is that none of it means anything without you," she said simply. "The house is just a building. The security is just money. The safety is just the absence of danger. But a life, a real life, the kind worth living that requires love, it requires partnership. It requires someone who sees you not just as you are, but as you could be." Boone stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered mountains. That had been his refuge and his prison for so long. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said. "I'm a broken man, Sadie. I failed at everything that mattered, as a lawman, as a husband, as a man who was supposed to protect the people. You loved. You saved our lives," she pointed out, "by accident, by being in the right place at the right time. You took us in when you could have turned us away. You shared your food, your fire, your home. You've been kinder to Tommy than his own father's family ever was. You've shown me what it means to be cherished, to be valued for who I am rather than what I can provide." Her voice grew stronger. "If that's what failure looks like, then I'll take a failed man over a successful one any day." He turned from the window to face her, and she could see the war being fought behind his eyes, love battling with fear, hope struggling against the weight of old grief and older failures. "What if I can't be what you need?" he asked. "What if I disappoint you the way I disappointed everyone else?" "What if you don't?" she countered. "What if we're exactly what each other needs? What if all this, the storm, the rescue, these weeks together, what if it's not accident but providence?" The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Providence, the idea that their meeting had been meant, that love could bloom even in the darkest circumstances, that broken people could make each other whole. "The sheriff offered me a badge," Boone said suddenly. "I know. I heard. I told him no. I know that too." Sadie moved closer, close enough to touch if she dared. "But maybe the question isn't whether you can be the man you were before. Maybe the question is whether you can be the man you're meant to be now." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter wasn't quite finished with the mountains. But inside, by the fire's warm glow, two people stood on the edge of a decision that would change everything, not just for them, but for the boy sleeping peacefully nearby, dreaming of wooden horses and fishing lessons in a world where families stayed together simply because they loved each other. Tomorrow would bring the journey down the mountain, the return to the world of other people and their expectations and judgments. Tomorrow would bring choices that couldn't be unmade and words that couldn't be unsaid. But tonight, there was still time for honesty, for hope, for the kind of conversation that happened only when two hearts recognized each other across the vast distances of pain and loss and learned to trust again in the possibility of joy. "Sadie," Boone said, her name a prayer on his lips, and in that single word, she heard everything he'd been too afraid to say. The love, the longing, the terrifying. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate griefs. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough. Boone woke to find Sadie already moving quietly around the cabin, gathering the last of their belongings with the efficiency of someone who had learned to pack a life into saddlebags. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if she were trying not to wake the ghosts that lived in the corners of the room. Tommy still slept by the dying fire, his wooden horse clutched against his chest, his face peaceful in the way that only children could manage. When the world was falling apart around them, Boone watched the rise and fall of the boy's breathing and felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, exactly, but shifting, like ice beginning to thaw. "The trail should be clear enough now," Sadie said without looking at him, her voice carefully neutral. She had folded the letter from the lawyer, her lifeline to independence, and tucked it safely into her coat pocket along with the deed to the house that would give her and Tommy everything they needed to start over. Everything. Except him. Moses looked strong, Boone observed, though the mule standing patiently outside looked as tired as Boone felt. "He'll get you to town safely." "Yes," she agreed, still not meeting his eyes. "He's a good animal, faithful." The word hung between them like an accusation. Faithful, something Boone had forgotten how to be, first to his duty as a lawman, then to his wife's memory, and now to his own heart. They moved through the morning preparations like dancers performing a choreographed routine, each knowing their steps but neither willing to acknowledge the music that played beneath their careful politeness. Boone saddled Moses and secured the packs. Sadie banked the fire and tidied the cabin as if she might be coming back, though they both knew she wouldn't be. Tommy woke slowly, clinging to sleep as long as possible, as if his unconscious mind understood what his waking self was trying to deny. "Time to go, sweetheart," Sadie said gently, helping her son into his coat. The garment, one of Boone's that she'd altered to fit, hung loose on Tommy's small frame, but it would keep him warm on the long ride down the mountain. Tommy looked around the cabin with the bewildered expression of someone trying to memorize a place he might never see again. His eyes lingered on the carved cross above Boone's bed, on the pile of wood shavings where they'd sat together whittling, on the corner where he'd played with his horse, while the adults talked in low voices about things he didn't understand. "Uncle Boone," he said suddenly, "I made something for you." The boy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden figure, rough carved but recognizable as a horse, its legs uneven and its mane more suggestion than detail. It was the work of inexperienced hands guided by a generous heart, and it was the most beautiful thing Boone had ever seen. "I wanted you to remember us," Tommy said with the solemn dignity of childhood, placing the carving in Boone's palm. The gesture nearly undid him. This child, who had nothing, had spent precious time creating something to leave behind, something to bridge the gap between presence and absence. Boone's throat closed around words he couldn't speak, around promises he couldn't make. "I'll treasure it," he managed finally, and meant it more than any words he'd ever spoken. The actual moment of departure was both eternally long and over too quickly. Boone helped Sadie mount Moses, their hands brushing as he adjusted the reins, and for just an instant, her careful composure cracked enough for him to see the pain beneath. "Boone," she began, then stopped. What was there to say that hadn't already been said in the long watches of the night, in the silences between words, in the careful way they'd avoided looking directly at each other all morning? Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, not the lawyer's letter, but something else, something written in her own careful hand. "For later," she said quietly, pressing it into his palm. "When you're ready." He wanted to protest, to say that he didn't need letters when he had memories, that he'd rather remember her voice than read her words on paper. But the look in her eyes stopped him. This was something she needed to give, just as Tommy's carved horse had been something the boy needed to leave behind. "Thank you," he said simply, tucking the letter into his shirt pocket, close to his heart where Martha's ring still hung on its leather cord. Tommy, secure in front of his mother on Moses's broad back, twisted around to wave as they started down the trail. "Goodbye, Uncle Boone. Don't forget to feed the birds." The mundane instruction, a reminder about the scraps Boone scattered each morning for the mountain jays, hit him harder than any grand farewell could have. This child had noticed the small kindnesses, had understood that even a hermit needed something to care for, some small life to tend. "I won't forget," Boone called back, his voice carrying farther in the thin mountain air than it should have. He stood in the doorway of his cabin and watched them disappear around the first bend in the trail, Sadie's straight back and Tommy's waving hand, the last things he saw before the pine trees swallowed them completely. The silence that followed was different from the silence he'd known for 7 years, heavier, more complete, as if the very air had been drained of possibilities. For a long time, he stood there listening to nothing, feeling the weight of Tommy's carved horse in one hand and Sadie's letter in his pocket over his heart. The cabin behind him felt cavernous and cold despite the banked fire, as if their presence had somehow expanded its walls and their absence had collapsed them again. Finally, when the sun was high enough to cast sharp shadows on the snow, Boone went back inside and closed the door. But he didn't unfold Sadie's letter, not yet. Some things he was learning required time and solitude and the kind of courage that could only be found in silence. Outside, Moses's hoofprints led away from the cabin toward town, toward Sadie's new life, toward a future that didn't include him. Inside, Boone sat by the fire and held a small wooden horse and tried to remember what it felt like to believe in second chances. Boone waited until the sun had climbed past the ridge before he finally unfolded Sadie's letter. His hands, steady enough to carve intricate patterns in wood or sight a rifle at 100 yards, shook as he smoothed the creases from the paper. Her handwriting was neat and careful, the script of a woman who had learned early that words mattered, that sometimes they were all you had left up, my dear Boone. By the time you read this, Tommy and I will be on our way to town, to our new life, to all the possibilities that inheritance has given us. I want you to know that I'm grateful for every moment we spent in your cabin, for every kindness you showed us, for the way you saved our lives in more ways than one. But I also want you to know that I'm not writing this to say goodbye. I'm writing this to tell you something I didn't have the courage to say to your face. You have been selling yourself short. You think you're a failed lawman, a broken man, someone who has nothing to offer. But I've seen who you really are. I've watched you teach my son to whittle with infinite patience. I've seen you ration food to make sure we had enough while going hungry yourself. I've witnessed the gentleness in your hands when you thought Tommy might die from the cold. The way you spoke to him like he mattered, like his small life was worth preserving. That's not failure, Boone. That's grace. Sheriff Coleman was right when he said the territory needs men like you. But more than that, people like Tommy and me, people who have lost everything and don't know how to find their way back to hope. We need men like you too. I know you think you have nothing to offer, but you're wrong. You have a heart that knows how to love despite loss. You have hands that know how to heal as well as hurt. You have wisdom earned through pain and strength born from surviving what should have broken you. You have everything I need, everything I want, everything I've been praying for without knowing I was praying. The house in town is lovely, I'm sure. The security is more than I dared hope for. But none of it means anything if I have to live there without you. None of it is worth having if I can't share it with the man who showed me what love looks like when it's real and honest and brave enough to try again. I'm not asking you to give up your mountain or abandon Martha's memory. I'm asking you to believe that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, that honoring the dead doesn't require forgetting how to live. I'm asking you to trust that what we found in that cabin wasn't just desperation or gratitude or loneliness. It was real, and it's worth fighting for. Sheriff Coleman offered you a badge. Take it. Not because the territory needs you, though it does. Not because it would prove you're not a failure, though it would. Take it because Tommy needs a father figure who shows up every day. Take it because I need a partner who believes in tomorrow as much as he mourns yesterday. Take it because sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to choose life. I'll be at the house on Elm Street, and I'll wait as long as it takes for you to find your courage. If you decide that your mountain is more important than our future, I'll understand. I'll be heartbroken, but I'll understand. But if you decide that love is worth the risk, that family is worth fighting for, that maybe, just maybe, God isn't finished with your story yet, then come find us. Come find me. You said once that you had nothing, and I had no one. But you were wrong, my dear man. Together, we have everything. With all my love, Sadie P.S. Tommy wanted me to tell you that he's going to keep practicing his whittling and he expects you to check his work when you come to visit. Children, I've learned, have an unshakable faith that love wins in the end. Maybe we should listen to them. Boone read the letter 3 times before he fully understood what she was asking of him. Not just to leave the mountain, though that was part of it. Not just to return to the world of other people, though that was necessary too. She was asking him to believe in the possibility of redemption, to trust that the same God who had allowed Martha to die might also allow him to love again. She was asking him to choose hope over fear, future over past, the terrifying uncertainty of connection over the safe loneliness of isolation. By the time he finished reading, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks. If he was going to catch up with them, he needed to leave now. The trail down the mountain was treacherous enough in daylight. Attempting it after dark would be suicide. Boone looked around the cabin that had been his refuge and his prison for 7 years. Martha's recipe book still sat on the shelf, her Bible beside it. The carved cross hung above the bed where he'd spent so many nights wrestling with grief and guilt and the slow death of hope. But now, for the first time since her funeral, he could imagine her voice clearly, not the fevered whispers of her final days, but the strong, clear tones of the woman who had loved him enough to marry him despite his flaws. Choose life, she seemed to say. Choose love. Choose the future I can't share with you, but that I want you to have. With hands that no longer shook, Boone began to pack his saddlebags. Not everything, some things belonged to this place, to the man he'd been. But enough for a new beginning, enough to build a different kind of life in town with a woman who saw in him not what he'd lost, but what he might still become. He was going after them. He was going to fight for love, for family, for the second chance he thought was impossible. He was going home. 6 months later, Boone stood in the garden behind the house on Elm Street, watching Tommy chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The boy had grown taller since that winter in the cabin, his legs stretching out like a young colt's, but his laugh was the same, pure and joyful and completely unguarded. "Got one," Tommy called out, cupping his hands carefully around a glowing insect. "Look, Uncle Boone, Pa, look how bright it is." The correction still caught Boone by surprise sometimes, the easy way Tommy had transitioned from Uncle Boone to Pa after the wedding 3 months ago. Sheriff Coleman had performed the ceremony in the small church on Main Street, with what seemed like half the town in attendance. Sadie had worn Martha's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Boone had never seen anything more beautiful than the way she looked walking down the aisle toward their future together. "That's a fine one," Boone agreed, moving closer to admire Tommy's catch. "See how the light comes from underneath? That's where the magic lives. Can I keep it?" Tommy asked, then immediately shook his head before Boone could answer. "No, that's silly. It needs to be free to find its family." He opened his hands and watched the firefly spiral up into the purple twilight, its light blinking like a tiny star. The wisdom in the gesture, understanding that some things were more beautiful when they were free, made Boone's throat tight with pride. This boy, who had lost so much so young, still understood that love sometimes meant letting go. The kitchen window glowed warmly behind them, and through it, Boone could see Sadie moving about, preparing their evening meal. She hummed while she worked, different melodies now, happier ones that spoke of contentment rather than endurance. The wedding ring he'd fashioned from mountain gold caught the lamplight as she worked, a perfect circle that symbolized the life they'd built together from the broken pieces of their separate griefs. "Boone?" Her voice drifted through the window. "Supper's ready." "Coming," he called back, but he lingered a moment longer in the garden, breathing in the scent of the roses she'd planted along the fence. The house had been lovely when they'd arrived, but Sadie had transformed it into something that felt like home, not just a place to live, but a sanctuary where love could grow and flourish. The deputy badge in his vest pocket caught the last rays of sunlight as he turned toward the house. He'd been wearing it for 5 months now, long enough that it felt natural again, part of who he was rather than a burden he carried. Sheriff Coleman had been right. The territory did need experienced lawmen, and Boone discovered that his years of solitude had given him something valuable: perspective. He understood now that justice wasn't about punishment or perfection, but about protection, keeping safe the things that mattered most. Inside, the dinner table was set for 3, as it had been every evening since they'd become a family. Sadie had made pot roast with vegetables from their garden, and the smell filled the small house with the kind of domestic comfort Boone had thought he'd lost forever. Tommy chattered about his day at school, about the arithmetic lesson that had confused him, and the story the teacher had read about a boy who tamed a wild horse. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm getting better at my letters," Tommy announced proudly. "She says maybe I could write a story about the mountains someday." "That's a fine idea," Boone said, cutting his meat carefully. "Mountains have lots of stories to tell. Will you help me remember the good parts?" Tommy asked, "About the cabin and the snow, and how you saved us." "We saved each other," Boone corrected gently, his eyes meeting Sadie's across the table. It was the truth they'd come to understand, that rescue was rarely a one-way street, that sometimes the act of saving someone else was what saved you in return. After supper, as they did every evening, they gathered in the small parlor. Sadie worked on her sewing. She'd established a modest business as a seamstress, taking in alterations and custom work for the town's ladies. Tommy practiced his whittling, his small hands growing more skilled with the knife Boone had made specifically for him. And Boone read aloud from whatever book had caught their interest. Tonight it was Treasure Island, and Tommy hung on every word about pirates and adventure. When it came time for bed, Tommy hugged them both goodnight with the fierce affection of a child who had learned not to take family for granted. After he'd settled in his room, Boone and Sadie sat on the front porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly, the question she posed sometimes when the evening was particularly peaceful, and the weight of their good fortune seemed almost too much to believe. "More than I ever thought I could be again," he answered honestly. "You?" "Sometimes I think I might burst from it," she said, laughing softly. "Is that possible? Can a person be too happy?" "I don't think so," Boone said, pulling her closer against his side. "I think maybe happiness is like those fireflies. It comes and goes, but while it's here, we should appreciate the light." Above them, the mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with silver moonlight. Boone's cabin was still up there, weathered and empty, slowly returning to the wilderness. He'd gone back once in late spring to collect a few personal items and to say goodbye to the man he'd been. The carved cross now hung in their bedroom, no longer a symbol of lost faith, but a reminder that even the darkest seasons eventually give way to spring. In his pocket, alongside the deputy badge, he carried Tommy's wooden horse, not the original, which Tommy kept on his bedside table, but a new one the boy had carved for him just last week. It was better than the first attempt, more detailed and proportioned, but it carried the same message. Remember us, remember this. Remember that love is worth every risk it takes to find it. As they sat together in the comfortable silence of a Nan's evening well spent, Boone reflected on the strange paths that had led them here. A blizzard that should have been tragedy becoming the force that brought them together. A mountain hermit learning that isolation wasn't strength but fear. A desperate widow discovering that love could bloom even in the most unlikely soil. "Thank you," he said suddenly. "For what?" Sadie asked, though her smile suggested she knew. "For not giving up on me. For seeing something worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. For teaching me that having nothing and being no one doesn't mean you can't build everything with someone who loves you." She turned in his arms and kissed him softly, her lips warm against his in the cool mountain air. When they parted, Her eyes held all the stars in the Wyoming sky. "You had it backwards from the beginning," she said gently. "You were never nothing, and I was never no one. We were just waiting for each other to come home." Home? The word settled around them like a blessing, encompassing not just the house with its warm windows and welcoming rooms, but the life they'd built together, imperfect, uncertain, but filled with the kind of love that made even the darkest winters feel like spring.